Okay, good morning. I think we're ready to start. So welcome. I'm Terry Doss, Director and Chief Restoration Scientist for the Meadowlands Research and Restoration Institute at the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. On behalf of the New Jersey Interagency Council on Climate Resilience, or IAC for short, we would like to thank you for joining us today to learn more about extreme heat's impacts on New Jersey's natural world. The IAC was established by Governor Murphy through Executive Order 89 and consists of 26 state departments and agencies coordinating action to advance New Jersey's climate change resilience strategy. Part of the IAC's mission is to educate New Jersey residents about and prepare them for the impacts of climate change and the actions needed to protect New Jerseyans. We encourage you to visit resiliencecouncil.nj.gov to learn more. This webinar is the sixth in a series designed to educate the public on extreme heat. Past webinars, held last summer and monthly since April, covered topics like climate patterns, extreme heat impacts, and New Jersey's preparedness. Recordings and summary videos are available on the events page of Heat Hub New Jersey for review. Today, we're exploring how extreme heat will impact New Jersey's natural spaces. Despite its size and proximity to major cities, New Jersey contains a remarkable number of ecosystems, including deciduous forests, tidal and non-tidal wetlands, estuaries, beaches, and of course, the New Jersey pine barrens, highlands, and meadowlands. And being located just off the Atlantic Ocean, New Jersey has nearly 130 miles of coastline whose waters, beaches, and bays have both significant ecological and economic importance to the state. Sitting at this geographical crossroads between the northern and southern ranges for many species, the biodiversity in New Jersey cannot be overstated, with nearly 5,000 species of plants, animals, and fungi calling this state their home. The impact that extreme heat is having on New Jersey's natural spaces is profound. Extreme heat poses a very real threat to the parks, forests, and beaches that we visit, plants and wildlife that we cherish, and industries that we rely on. So today, we're fortunate to have with us a panel of ecology and natural resource experts to help us better understand how heat can impact New Jersey's biodiversity, natural resources, as well as plant and animal life. I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists, but please visit the events page on Heat Hub New Jersey to view their full profiles. First up is Dr. Dina Fonseca, who's a tenured professor and chair of the Department of Entomology at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences at Rutgers University. She's the director of Rutgers Center for Vector Biology and also works with residential communities to develop proactive strategies for the surveillance and control of urban vectors such as mosquitoes and ticks. Next is Dr. Jennifer Crummins, who is an ecologist that has centered her career on soil ecology and how plant and soil interactions change in response to anthropogenic disturbance. Dr. Crummins is a professor at Montclair State University, the science director at the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, and most recently, the president of the Soil Ecology Society of America. Finally, Dr. Samir Patel is a marine biologist who has been with the Knamusset Farm Foundation since 2014. For context, CFF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to scientific research and education that promotes sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, and agriculture. At the CFF, Samir has worked on multiple projects, including outfitting commercial fishing vessels with oceanographic sensors and using telemetry and optical approaches to study the ecology of commercially valuable fish species. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. But before we get to the questions, I just need to lay out a few housekeeping items for the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and that recording will get posted on the events page of Heat Hub New Jersey a few days after the event. Audience members are in listen-only mode to cut down on background noise during the discussion. Today's format is interview style. As moderator, I have a set of prepared questions for the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to the audience to see if you all have any questions. And if you do, please jot those down in the chat feature, and we'll do our best to get to them during the Q&A section. So let's get started. I'll start with you, Dr. Fonseca. Why are ticks and mosquitoes a threat to humans and pets? And what species are typically encountered, and what diseases do they potentially carry? I know it's a big question.
It is a big question. Can you hear me okay? All right. So insects are the largest group of organisms, of animals on Earth. There's over 1 million species described. Ticks, by the way, are not insects, as a lot of people tend to think. They're actually more closely related to arachnids, like spiders. So they're arachnids, not insects. Together, they're a huge diversity, very diverse group of organisms. But, and this is comes, I think arthropods, which is what insects, arachnids, crustacea, which are the ones in things like shrimp that we love, crabs, all of those are part of this large group of arthropods that mostly are critical and very important that they continue living and thriving in New Jersey and everywhere else on Earth. However, there are a few that have become and they be deleterious to us. Some of them, like lots of salt marsh mosquitoes, are just a nuisance. They really don't transmit any. They're not important as transmitters of diseases, which is where they become a problem in terms of human health. They're just nuisance, which some of us may consider an important disease problem also, just they're annoying. Um, so there's a small number that are a problem. Some of them are a problem because we go into their habitat and they bite us. Some of them, however, have adapted to our environments. And so most of the mosquitoes in New Jersey that are especially problematic are not coming from wetlands, they're not coming from lakes or in natural resources, natural areas. They're coming from our backyards. They are developing in stagnant water and still water in small containers. In some cases, they also may be coming from larger bodies of water, things like sewers or stormwater containers. And there's a group of those mosquitoes called house mosquitoes because they actually originally from Europe. There are the primary transmitters, i.e. vectors, since they move a disease agent from one host to another. In the case of these mosquitoes, they are the main vectors of West Nile virus, which is actually a bird disease. So most of the infected hosts are birds. Those are the important reservoirs of West Nile virus. And then when these mosquitoes that are primarily bird biters bite a person, you may become infected. And so I just covered a large amount of information. So in summary, most mosquitoes and most ticks are not a problem. There's a small subset that are a problem primarily when we go into their environment. However, there's another subset that have adapted to our backyards, our cities, in particular our suburbs, and in to sort of finish up this. Like I said, this is like 2 semesters of information. Things like the Asian tiger mosquito, for example, which is a species that was not present in New Jersey until 1995. It arrived in the United States for the first time as established populations in 1985 in Texas, and then quickly spread east and north. It's found now in large swath of our cities. A mosquito like that is a particular problem because they are capable of transmitting diseases among humans. So I mentioned the house mosquito Culex that transmits West Nile virus. As I said, that's a bird biting mosquito, is picking pathogens from disease agents from birds, and then eventually they may infect people. But as you know, West Nile virus is a problem, but it's not a huge problem. But something like the Asian tiger mosquito can move pathogens like dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, Zika among people. And those are the mosquitoes that can be especially important in terms of public health. And I'll stop there.
That was a very concise answer, and I think it's important to note that swamps always get blamed, our wetlands get blamed, our natural spaces get blamed, but people really have some onus on this. There's something they can do about it. But let's turn to the extreme heat. New Jersey's warming at a faster rate than the global average, and because of this, New Jersey is expected to become warmer throughout the entirety of the year, not just summer, including winter and autumn, and with added precipitation levels. So have these warmer and wetter seasons contributed to the expansion of these disease-carrying vectors here in New Jersey? And if so, how do these changing conditions affect the tick and mosquito populations? another big question.
Right. Again, let me stick with mosquitoes for now, for a second.
Okay.
So, and actually, no, actually, I don't need to stick with this. So, what happens with arthropods in general? All of these organisms, they are dependent on the temperature of the environment. So, if the environment is warmer, their metabolism is going to be faster, which means they're going to develop faster, and that means they can have more of them. It's sort of in a nutshell, hotter is good for arthropods, especially hotter and more rain because a lot of arthropods, in fact, the best way to control, say, this unsavory creature called the bed bug is not to apply insecticides, it's to dry them up. It's to use heat and dry their environment, not really necessarily applying insecticides because at this point, most of them are resistant to most insecticides we try to use on them. So the reverse, so you have a warm environment but wet, that actually increases their mortality. That increases their capacity to develop faster and create bigger populations. So you end up having a population start earlier in the season and end up extending later in the season. And we have observed that with the mosquito populations in New Jersey. The so-called active season used to be June 1st until the end of October. It now often starts in the mid of April and can go into the middle of November. And that just allows for bigger, larger populations. The second thing that is happening is that we're seeing populations of species that were primarily in southern United States coming into the northern, so coming into New Jersey in specific. And New Jersey is this cool rectangle that actually is in many ways like a mini United States. Southern New Jersey is it has a drier environment, it's coastal plain, and can be almost like it's always been very different from, say, central, which is more urban, and then definitely northwestern, that is much cooler. And we have very different population species of mosquitoes in the northwest versus the south. We now have new species that are arriving from the southern United States, have spread across New Jersey. And those, again, they're coming into a new environment in many cases. The predators are not necessarily expanding as fast as they are. And so you can have very large populations, things like Culex erraticus, a mosquito with a cool name like Tormentor has also now been spread out. Mosquito people have great names for their populations. So, or there's also molestus, things like that. So you can have these expanded populations that can be particularly complicated. We see the same thing with ticks. So the Gulf Coast tick, to give you an example, we have 64 species of mosquitoes in New Jersey. We have 15 species of ticks. We now have 16 because the Gulf Coast tick, as the name indicates, from the Gulf Coast, a southern species, is now actually found pretty much across the entire state of New Jersey. And as it gets warmer, you start seeing the populations growing across the state. So that's a sort of a clear, A plus B equals C. That is the result of getting warmer and in particular also a lot more rain. So the combination of warmth and humidity.
So it sounds like the changing conditions will increase the probability of encountering these disease-carrying vectors. So what actions can people take to prevent the encountering or getting bit?
Well, like I said, and I said that in response to the first part, the biggest problems are really these mosquitoes that are coming out of our backyard. So the Asian tiger mosquito is one of the most problematic species in terms of disease transmission. So if you have large populations of Asian tiger mosquito, then you could have, for example, someone coming into the state infected with chikungunya or Zika, and before they may not know they're infected, and they may not know they're infectious to mosquitoes, because in some of these these viruses, people can feel perfectly fine. They went and had a very nice vacation somewhere in Central South America, also parts of Asia. They come back, they're out in their backyard. Their backyard has a lot of Asian tiger mosquitoes. They get bit, those mosquitoes become infected, and you can have an outbreak because of that. Now, I'm not saying this is a pure theoretical kind of thing. This exact scenario happened in 2007 in northern Italy, actually in an environment on the Adriatic Ocean, very similar to New Jersey. I visited there, and I thought, wow, this totally could happen in New Jersey. It's a very similar kind of environment, same kind of latitude, same kinds of populations of Asian tiger mosquito. What can we do? Don't have containers of water in your backyard. It's really not that complicated. That's the first part. The second part, wear repellents. The best way, and this is also true for ticks. I mean, I know that we all have a tendency to feel like these organisms shouldn't be out here, but I always give this example. Skin cancer is a very serious problem, and nobody is proposing we put out the sun because we need to address skin cancer. No, we say, hey, wear, SPF 50 and, wear hats. Same way with mosquitoes and ticks. It's personal responsibility. The best way to address a problem like this, besides, try to limit global climate change and to do all the things we need to do to limit increases in temperature and humidity, is to have responsibility, wear repellents, and in the case of with mosquitoes and ticks, I always give again another sort of example, which is it's the the ticks and mosquitoes be like tortoise and the hare. So ticks are like everything is slow. They take hours, days to bite you and infect you with pathogens. So wear repellents when you come back from an environment where you're exposed to ticks. Do tick checks. With mosquitoes, wear repellents and try to minimize the populations of mosquitoes that are actually coming from your backyard, because those are truly the most important, the most likely to bite people. The ones that are out in the wetlands are actually, in some cases, pollinators, and they're important parts of the ecosystem of the environment.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Dr. Crummins for a moment. And as I stated earlier, despite its small size and proximity to large cities, New Jersey really boasts this remarkable number of natural spaces as well as animal, fungi, and plant life that they call home. Can you provide a bit more detail on the importance of New Jersey's biodiversity to New Jersey's outdoor spaces, as well as why a thriving biodiversity is also important for New Jersey's residents and communities?
Yeah, absolutely. My answers really extend quite nicely from using, the mosquito examples and the tick examples, frankly. As you said in the intro, what we have in New Jersey is this spectacular diversity of habitats, diversity of ecosystems, diversity of habitats at a pretty large scale. You have an entire, coastal beach on the Atlantic Ocean, but then you've got the bays and estuaries of the Delaware, the mountains in the north, the agriculture in the south and the pine barrens in the south. And then in the middle of all that, which is very important to all of this, you have, at least two massive urban centers flanking this. And we can't exclude the human influence on shaping the ecosystems that we have. So what you get with all of those, the varieties of habitats, the varieties of ecosystems, is also variety of organisms that are going to occupy those ecosystems. New Jersey has a lot of organisms that are very specialized to those habitats. Think about the pine barrens. There's a lot of native organisms that call the pine barrens home, that are very unique and special to us. And so those are the mechanisms in place that are maintaining and promoting the biodiversity of our state. But I think your question is why does this matter, and why do we really care as the climate is changing and as we're getting hotter?
Yep.
Biodiversity is an insurance policy on ecosystem functions and ecosystem services. So ecosystem services and ecosystem functions is kind of big ecology speak for what is the environment doing for you. So some very famous common ecosystem services that we can all wrap our heads around pretty quickly are the idea of, in an agricultural environment, diversity of pollinators, diversity of bees and flies and birds and various organisms that are fertilizing our plants and allowing our fruit and our crops to grow. That's an important ecosystem service. Decomposition is an important ecosystem service. Some of the more obscure and harder to wrap your head around ecosystem services that are provided by biodiversity are carbon sequestration. If you have greater organism diversity in the soil, there's huge amounts of literature that show this, that then you have greater carbon storage in that soil as well, just from the plant roots, and then all the organisms from the bacteria, fungi on up to the microarthropods and the worms and everything else are supporting maintaining that carbon safely and stored in the soil and not in the atmosphere, further feeding back on climate change. But also, in a very direct way, more diverse ecosystems are, well, they're stable, and then they're going to help maintain and, protect those environmental services, those ecosystem services we value. But then they're also healthier and more productive. A more diverse forest is more likely to produce more green biomass and support more birds, say. Well, those green spaces and those open spaces also provide cooling and allow for moderating of temperatures, moderating of, at least on the microclimate scale, moderating, microclimate variation, extremes in heat and extremes in cool. And so this all comes back to, one, protecting biodiversity is the right thing to do for so many different reasons, but also protecting biodiversity because there's so many important things that biodiversity is doing for us that we don't even fully understand. So by just kind of carelessly bulldozing a forest and carelessly bulldozing an entire environment, you could be directly losing species that are doing something important that we don't appreciate. And to bring it all full circle and keep this a tidy argument is, you have a container of water in your backyard and potentially growing mosquitoes in it. Well, if we have a lot of different diversity of insects in the environment around, then maybe the effects of some of the bad players that are causing us illness, certain disease-carrying mosquitoes, maybe they won't be quite as profound if they're sitting within the context of a biodiverse environment.
When you talk about biodiversity providing for stability and moderation, but then, and I'll open this up to everyone after Dr. comments, how will extreme heat impact New Jersey's biodiversity? And tomorrow we're faced with some heat indexes that'll be above 100 degrees. So it's pretty timely, but how will extreme heat affect biodiversity?
Oh, yeah, it's so hard to answer this briefly. I'll be quick so I can let my colleagues talk too, but I know oh gosh, the first thing that comes to my mind is, you even mentioned in the introduction, New Jersey is, the whole mid-Atlantic region is a convergence zone of northern existing populations and communities of organisms, and the northern range of southern species and the southern range of northern species. I hope that came across clearly. And so by imposing much higher heat or humidity or even rainfall changes onto an area that's already in a transition zone, then you're going to tip it in one direction or the other, and we're going to lose those species that live in that very delicate balance of that transition zone. So, and then the first example I would throw you to is just think of the example of flowering plants and their pollinators. And certain, the phenology of plants, the timing of when they flower with seasonality is for generation upon generation, thousands and thousands of years, has been timed with their pollinators. And some of those plant pollinator interactions are incredibly specific. There's one pollinator or there's one plant resource for one particular insect, and those could easily get disjointed by changes in the temperature and the climate and on the short term, even the weather. So, and I'll let my friends jump in there too.
I think you're on mute. I think you're on mute.
I'm sorry, I sort of jumped in. I didn't see Samir say anything. So I was going to mention that a lot of these relationships are nonlinear. So especially when you bring in parasites, pathogens into the equation, extreme heat is not good for an arthropod, an insect, a mosquito. The very, very high temperatures, especially beyond their optimal temperature, is going to be deleterious. And it can have sort of funky effects. For example, the hotter it gets, the smaller the mosquitoes get. And I know some of you out there are going to go, what? Mosquitoes in New Jersey are enormous. Those are probably not mosquitoes, but we can talk about that separately. But so smaller mosquitoes, because they develop faster, can actually be more susceptible to parasites, pathogens, and be more likely to transmit said pathogens. So, but they also may live less long, so they may be have short-lived. So it's really hard to disentangle these relationships. As Jennifer mentioned, it's just that you get them out of sync. And it's a little hard to predict what the outcomes can be. But we do know that smaller mosquitoes are more susceptible, more likely to become infected with some of these viruses than the larger mosquitoes that developed slower in their aquatic stage. And I should mention that that's an important part to the lifestyle. The part that we see flying around is a very small proportion of the most of the mosquito life cycle is actually in water.
Yeah, I think to add to that, extreme heat, think there's a difference between sort of extreme events and then these long-term changes to the environment. And so there's a very distinct shift that'll happen from extreme events. There's studies that indicate higher sea surface temperatures will lead to more storms, bigger storms, things like that. And when you have that increased level of instability in the environment, you have a big storm go through and you can change the ecosystem significantly in one event. That's a unique experience that comes with rising temperatures. And then there's that gradual change that comes with rising temperatures where on an annual basis, things are slightly shifting slowly. So I think it's hard to necessarily, I think it's important to distinguish the two. So we had an example where we looked at our turtle data to see how they react to hurricanes coming through the region, and the sea surface temperature and the thermocline shifts in the mid-Atlantic were significant just from one hurricane, and it didn't recover. It happened in late August, and that was sort of the time that the ecosystem just turned over, and it just stayed that way. So things like that can have dramatic immediate effects where then you have that trophic mismatch that was talked about with pollinators and pollen blooming at different times. Our turtles moved out of the region at a different time than they normally do, and who knows if they were able to achieve the resources they were here to achieve in that time period, and then they may then delay other parts of their life because of it. So extreme events have a unique situation versus that gradual change, and sometimes I think it's key to distinguish them and notice that they're
Thank
major.
You. Yeah, that is really important. And in terms of protecting biodiversity, I know from my work that one strategy is the improvement of corridors and habitat connectivity. And this may include targeted efforts to make our built human infrastructure more amenable and less dangerous to wildlife, as well as land acquisition and restoration. So Dr. Crummins and Dr. Patel, how would you say extreme heat impacts those activities of trying to protect biodiversity?
Dr. Patel, do you want to go first? I have thoughts, but they're brief. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, take me a second to think about this as well, and it maybe follow up with what I just mentioned. I mean, I know with the pine barrens in particular, there is a fire cycle that goes through that region that is extremely important to that region. But that fire cycle is a cycle, and so there should be some level of predictability to that. Without the predictability, again, when we have extreme events like a major forest fire that occurred just a few months ago, I think maybe the timing was wrong. So I think that is an important part of, as Dr. Crummins mentioned earlier, when we alter the environment, we then alter the stability of the environment. And so when an extreme event occurs, it becomes more extreme than what we're used to, for sure. I think that's the major part of our human impact.
And I completely agree with what Dr. Patel is saying. And it's It's just going to be more challenging. No ecosystem is ever truly stable over some course of time. We all get that. That said, maintaining environments that are critical to the conservation of biodiversity for certain groups, like just say wetlands, certainly freshwater wetlands, as immediately comes to mind, is going to be incredibly difficult in a hotter, drier environment. But I think where my mind immediately went with this question is maybe it's a call to action. Is the importance of your question is also the importance of doing what you're saying and maintaining green spaces and land acquisition and restoration in light of challenges, because I see those, not only are they maintaining biodiversity, but then they're also mitigating climate change. They're environments that not only support diverse and interesting and valuable species, but they're also, going to provide cooling and provide carbon sequestration. And, there's the most beautiful mitigation measure I can think of is, leave it alone. Let a huge patch of forest or wetland or, grassland, let nature do what nature wants to do. So I see that question as, let's flip it around and let's more talk about, yes, we need to do this for these reasons. Yes, it's going to be a challenge. A lot of things are going to be a challenge.
Thank you. The Pine Barrens has been mentioned a couple times. It's often highlighted as being an important and unique ecosystem for that part of the world. What does make it so special, and how will a hotter New Jersey impact the Pine Barrens?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, I love it. I did my PhD there, and now I'm lucky enough to get to work down there. It is special. It's ecologically special. It's ecologically special because you have just a couple of important abiotic factors coming together to shape a very unique and quite large patch of forested land. The hydrology of the Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer, for one thing, but also, the 100,000 years of history that has shaped South Jersey as this coastal plain, with that hydrology and that fire ecosystem that Dr. Patel was talking about is absolutely important. And then you also have the human impact. The humans, we have to moderate that fire. I also think that a big part of what makes the Pine Barrens so special, the Pine Lands so special, is that it's there because of human will. In the 1970s, they said, don't build an airport there. They said, pardon me, they said, this is a spectacular, huge, valuable patch of, relatively pristine forest. And we can conserve this. And they did it. And that is, kind of miraculous, quite frankly. And they did it, and they've successfully maintained it, with the Pinelands Commission and the DEP, but also the Pinelands Preservation Alliance and the people that live there that are working to keep it so intact. So intact. So we need to keep working on that. Again, another call to action in the face of challenges that just, we can't lose grip on our goals. All right. So what makes it so special also, that is very directly related to this conversation we're having here today, is that two of the huge environmental factors that maintain that distinct, unique ecology there that supports all this wonderful biodiversity and endemic species and, beautiful, fabulous green space is that aquifer underneath, the hydrology of that environment. The Kirkwood-Cohansey Aquifer is constantly maintaining those wetlands, but then also, you have very different upland and lowland habitats and ecosystems, and the upland versus the lowland is like, 10 feet makes a difference. It's so cool. So there's that. And hotter and drier is going to put a massive strain on that aquifer. Humans are going to pull from it more. The hotter, drier climate is going to make it drop. Humans are going to therefore pull for it more because we need more water. And it's just a kind of a frustrating, sad, and stressful loop. And then the other one is fire ecology. It is a fire-driven ecosystem, but we have humans living there. We have schools there. We have people living their lives there. And we have agriculture there. And we have to, so fire has to be managed. It has to be managed. We can't just let it go. And then, so if they're, and that becomes tricky, and sometimes it comes out of the management boundaries that, we've got really good people working on fire management in South Jersey, and, it's not always easy to control. And so those two important abiotic factors are what make it, ecologically so special. And those things are both going to be just critically affected by extreme heat and climate change in general.
Given all that, are there any species that you think will be potentially affected more than others?
I really want to say, I think my mind goes to the amphibians first. You have, the Pine Barrens tree frog. I love it. It's this beautiful, wonderful little frog. And it uses the Atlantic white cedar swamps as part of its life cycle. And then those cedar swamps themselves, that's an ecosystem, but it's got that one beautiful, spectacular, iconic species. Well, they're themselves vulnerable. But going back to the hydrology, as that hydrology changes, you're going to see differences in when those forests are wet and when those forests are dry. And sometimes they're drier than they should be. And I've actually, seen this with my own eyes, where I'm like, that shouldn't be dry right now. That shouldn't be dry right now. And it is. And so that affects the health and the productivity of those forests, but then obviously the organisms they support. And so then I immediately go to something like the Pine Barrens tree frog, just because that's, right within my wheelhouse. But think about, and I would love to talk to someone more informed than me about this right now, but, we have so many different other amphibians, salamanders, and wonderful salamander populations and newt populations up in the northwest of the state as well, that, as things get hotter, as things potentially get drier or get wetter at the wrong times, maybe, it's going to, especially wetter at the wrong times. You think about, salamander migrations and salamander breeding. And if it's not wet when it's supposed to be wet, if it's not wet in March, but then it's soaking wet in August, that doesn't work for them. The timing won't work for the productivity of those populations. So that's my first thought, is on the amphibians, but also, again, rare plants. Rare plants and the pollinators that support them. Seasonality is just going to change that. Now I'm being redundant with things I've already said, so I'll be brief. But I think I think there's a lot of groups within there that are distinctly vulnerable because they're highly specialized. It's a highly specialized, unique, rare plant that has a highly specialized, insect pollinator relationship.
Right.
That's vulnerable.
Okay, thank you. And
Yeah, sure.
it makes me think of how we watched the hydrology change in the more northern parts of New Jersey that wiped out all the Atlantic white cedar swamps. So, and now it's just development driven, not climate change driven on top of that. So we've definitely learned some of those lessons. Well, we've seen the lessons. I don't know that we've learned from them yet. But let's turn to the aquatic world a little bit, Dr. Patel. Broadly speaking, and here's another big question, how will hotter winters, summers, evenings impact New Jersey's coastal and marine environments? In a nutshell.
Yeah. So as we talked about with biodiversity, there's probably going to be a shrinking of that diversity aspect of it, which is a common part of climate change. Animals move away, other animals move in, and as we go through those successions in ecosystem of shifting species, you start with sort of the quickest one to take over a space. For example, black sea bass, that is a common commercial and recreational fish species that people fish for in the South Atlantic and now the Mid-Atlantic, and now where I am in Cape Cod, it's a common species that people fish for. And that was not the case maybe 10 years ago. So it's happened pretty quickly already because they're very good at taking over reefs, and they can go from reef to reef. They can swim across open ocean fairly well, staying on the bottom. And where they used to have a routine of wintering away from shore and then coming back near shore, sometimes some individuals don't need to do that anymore. So there just seemed to be a change in their ecology and the way that they are able to inhabit a space and remain in that space effectively in times where a cold temperature would shift, well, would displace them and then reset the environment a little bit. Now they just stay, and then they're the dominant fish species of the region. So things like that are already occurring. And in the coastal environments, we were just out last week driving an ROV through some of the the wrecks, the artificial reefs that New Jersey has put out there. We were in the Atlantic City recreational reef, and it was surprising. I mean, we put the ROV down, and all the fish were kind of tiny, and there were just starfish and urchins, and the biodiversity was a lot less than we expected for an artificial reef. And this is a combination of things. It's near shore, so there's probably a lot of fishing pressure on it. But at the same time, artificial reefs, the whole point of them is to increase biodiversity, to generate a scale above the surrounding environment. And so that was sort of an interesting finding. Perhaps if we were there in a different season, perhaps if we were there before all the summer fishing pressure, it would look different. But it was just something unique that we experienced while we were out there just last week. And then sort of to focus a little more on my expertise of sea turtles, we've noticed from our studies with temperature that the expectation is they're going to move further north. But this has to play a role with their foraging ecology. I mean, they're going to go where they can find food. If their food isn't shifting in that capacity, if they're going to different areas and then they can't find food to forage on, well, they'll just keep moving until they can. So they're a little bit more resilient to the temperature, but they're highly dependent on animals that are probably less resilient to the temperature. So that is sort of the dilemma. Just because an individual species might be resilient to it doesn't mean the things that they depend on are resilient to it. And so that plays a big role in how we think about climate change impact on an animal. The individual species, you do a single study, okay, this animal is going to do this, but their ecological role and their niche is extremely important in understanding how that has a larger impact on the ecosystem.
And kind of building on that, how do you think extreme heat will impact the health and economic viability of commercial fisheries in the aquaculture industry?
So there is a really excellent study that came out of a scientist based in New Jersey who looked at a whole range of commercial fisheries of the Northwest Atlantic, benthic fisheries, invertebrate fisheries, pelagic fisheries, and assessed how those populations of commercially valuable fish species would shift, and then also the economics of the vessels who target those species. And there was a general trend that fish species and the commercially valued fish species would move north, as kind of all assume. They just find the climate and ecosystem that fits their thermal range. But then the dilemma is, if you're a New Jersey-based boat and you fish on offshore Atlantic sea scallops, for example, historically, you could just go out of New Jersey, maybe a 8-hour steam just straight to the coastal or continental shelf region, fish, get your quota, and come home. Now, unfortunately, the mid-Atlantic region, the biomass of sea scallops is not enough to sustain a high-quality fishery in the mid-Atlantic states. And so those boats out of New Jersey now steam 35 hours, and they go north to Georges Bank, and then they fish up there to then achieve the same amount of quota and financial gain that they were hoping for with the fishery than they had been 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And so that is a huge financial impact to go from a 5-hour steam requiring, thousands of gallons of gas to now a 30-hour steam. They lose a day of fishing. They lose the fuel costs. They then have to offload probably somewhere in Massachusetts, like New Bedford, where they're jockeying for position on the dock, and they have to pay rental fees, and they have to do all these different things, and then find their way back home eventually. So those types of things are already happening in fisheries that we work with. And it's a combination of probably climate shifting. The mid-Atlantic is a little buffered by what's called the cold pool. So in the summer months, there's a really strong thermocline where the surface water is very hot and the bottom water is generally cool. And this helps buffer some major changes in the summer to the ecosystem there. But if the cold pool shrinks, if the cold pool changes its position in where it is on the shelf waters, then it's going to have very high impact to a lot of benthic species and species at the lower third of the water column. And so we work very closely with the scallop fishery, and we're already seeing a pretty significant change in their tactics and also in the number of boats that come out of a traditionally scallop-friendly region like the Mid-Atlantic.
Thank you. What I've heard from all of you is that there's this delicate balance and relationships aren't linear and there's all these hard to predict outcomes. So we know a little, but we need to understand a lot more, I would assume. I have one last question before we turn it over to our audience, and this is for all of you. How do gradual but persistent changes to New Jersey's seasons affect our ability to further the broader ecosystem preservation and habitat protection goals that we talked about earlier? It seems like that's one of our biggest strategies, but how do we do that? So who wants to jump in first?
I'll jump first because what happens when you have warmer, winter is a great sanitizer. And when you start getting unfriendly species of mosquitoes and ticks, people become negative towards the environment. Just that fact, just the fact that people are afraid of going outdoors can have an enormous impact on how we're going to be willing to decide to protect them, to protect the environment. So I just wanted to kind of put that in right at the beginning. And all of that cascades from it.
Really important.
I didn't I've never really thought about it that way. Yeah, it's so interesting to hear different perspectives from your friends. My answer to this is the challenge is, and this is partly where I thought Dr. Fonseca was about to go, but where I would go with it is, you add heat to a system, you're adding energy. You keep adding energy to a system, and that's not necessarily stable, and it's definitely not predictable. You have water on the stovetop and you keep adding heat to it and it boils, and that's energy, and that's, try to track where all those bubbles are going. So I think that from the point of view of ecology and understanding systems, and even I work relative to my friends here on this call, I work in a pretty stable system, a soil ecologist. Soil is, relative to what they're working with, somewhat stable. You add heat and energy to a system, and ecologically it's hard to track. And then sociologically and economically, that's even harder to track. You have so many converging variables here. I don't know anyone that's good enough at statistics to sort that out. There's just too many converging variables, and too many of them are hard to follow, and it's absolutely nonlinear. That's a perfect word. And I mean, it's not easily predictable. And then asking our government and our organizations to build policy and practice around something that's so hard to predict is going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah, and I think ecosystem preservation is one of the most difficult things to do because you don't know where are you preserving it to. What is the baseline that you're trying to go back to? Yeah. You can't.
We're never going
nothing's
back.
going back. Yeah, nothing's going back.
We're not going back.
So what do you preserve? Where do you preserve it? I mean, with the way that with our research, there's also so much the limitations on the sample side. The amount of research that we do every time you check soil, you're probably like, oh, that's something different. You've been checking soil for so many years. And, every time I tag a turtle, and I've done over 300 now, I'm like, oh, that was new. Now what's the baseline? Now what's the trend? The trend is constantly changing. And so where do you preserve to is a really counting, but you're hoping that by counting, you're creating state in that scenario. By having some interest in sea turtles, people have a stake in sea turtles, and then as a result, people want to preserve them to just simply exist. And then having them exist hopefully means there's stability in the ecosystem, and their impact, or having the soil stay stable hopefully means the ecosystem stays stable. So I think that is a big dilemma of preservation. But we have to create value in these things to then make people understand. Oh yeah, okay, let's keep them.
So there's a number of challenges, and one of our someone from our audience posted what I think of as a challenge, which is given the current regulatory climate, is there any potential state policy or insurance or other protection mechanism in place for conservation projects when they face damage from extreme heat and natural disasters? A little bit of a loaded question.
It's a fantastic question. I don't want to say there. I don't know. I should know the answer to that. I don't know specifically. I don't know if my friends do.
Well, there are some programs for so we seeing sea level rise. I also work with saltmarsh mosquitoes. So sea level rise coastal communities there are some state programs to try to help, but it specifically about and again although I do teach a course called Insects and Conservation, insects have such a loaded and negative impact on the psyche of people. I love the fact, Jennifer, that you did not expect my answer, but I'm a communicator. I work a lot with communities, and that's what I pick up is the importance of, like, let's not feel like, oh my God, all is lost. It's the small changes, is giving people basic strategies to address small things like, yeah, you got bit by a mosquito, no big deal. Let's move on. It's great to be out there and really enjoy the environment and give it the value it deserves, and then put the effort to preserve it without being, oh my gosh, I just got bit, I'm going to go home. It really is important, like baby steps, to kind of, the victory is hard, but the victory is ours is kind of my logo, because it is hard, but we're all in this together. So it's really important that we all help each other come up with strategies to mitigate global climate change and do the best we can to preserve this amazing environment that is New Jersey, even with all its mosquitoes and ticks.
So and just further back to that viewer's question too is, I think absolutely with sea level rise. Also, I think with fire, I think we also have policies in place. But now when I get off this call, I need to go do a little research on that.
Well, I would say things like this state webinar, getting the information out and letting people know that you don't need to be afraid of mosquitoes and that sort of thing. When we do have open spaces, sometimes people are afraid. They understand a building. They understand the construction of a building. They don't understand a tree. Trees are messy. Trees do this or that. And so continuing to use our language in a way that helps people to better understand these benefits that we get from the open spaces and the things that we find out there that we might look scary to us. I'm sorry, Dr. Patel, you were going to add something?
Yeah, just sorry, that last question about state policy and stuff. I don't know about insurance or policies. I think it's important to give sort of props to New Jersey right now for taking fairly big steps to do a lot of research prior to the wind turbines going in. They've gotten quite a bit of funding for that, and they've distributed that funding effectively in a way that we're going to learn a lot about the Mid-Atlantic. And it's happening now. There's a lot of research that's happening now, and it's through the whole trophic scale, from large-scale whales all the way down to benthic invertebrates and oceanography. And so that's not exactly an insurance policy, but it's insurance to get a sense of like what is going to happen after those turbines if they get put up. I'm not entirely sure what's happening with that, but that is a pretty major step to preservation. You know, some sort of baseline. You know, like, okay, at least, you know, we know what it was like now. You know, we know what the environmental conditions were now. So let's at least have that sense before we change it dramatically. So that, I think that's an important thing that the state is doing currently.
Excellent. There is a question for Dr. Fonseca, and it kind of builds on this conditioning of being scared of mosquitoes, and there's an instant reaction to start spraying pesticides everywhere.
Yeah,
And
I read the question, and
any thoughts?
the answer is no. They were not applying insecticides or acaricides to control ticks. They were likely applying herbicides. So it is a complicated. There are no strategies in place to control ticks. That's one of my fields of research. And again, there's so much misunderstanding about basic tick ecology. And so this is also part of the reason we're actually reaching out to start working with PCOs, which are pest control operations, to try to really increase the information. And I also work with homeowners so they understand the kinds of questions you need to ask when somebody comes to your house and asks, can I, do you want me to control mosquitoes or ticks in your backyard? We need to have an informed citizenship so that people can understand what they're getting themselves into when talking about arthropods in general, ticks, mosquitoes, fleas, bed bugs, you name it. I'm sorry, more entomology is what we kind of need. Although we're all more soil ecology, more marine biology. Although marine biology has always been a strong suit in biology majors. But it really is. We tend to not understand and fear what we don't understand. And that also goes for insecticides, by the way, but we really don't have a lot of time here. And I should also mention there are 21 counties in New Jersey and 21 county mosquito control programs that are extremely well regulated and extremely informed of best ways to control mosquitoes, and also have information on ticks. So if you have a question, please reach out to your local mosquito control program.
Thank you. And there's a lot more questions, and I'm sorry we don't have time. This chat is so important, and I really appreciate how the three of you were able to answer these huge questions in very concise statements. So thank you, and thank you all who attended today. We appreciate you joining us. And I think the takeaway, for me at least, is that there's something that we all can do. And at the very least, let's look at our language and how we talk about these issues, and show people why they can't be afraid, but why they can actually do some things in their own backyard that can help us all. So with that, hope you all have a good day and stay cool over the weekend.
Thank you for the
Thank
invitation.
you. It's a lot of fun. Thanks a lot.
Bye.